He was just 20 when he became king. By 30, he had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen, without losing a single battle. But his story is not simply one of war and glory. It is a story of dreams, of longing, and of a boy who imagined the edge of the world, and then rode out to find it. So now, let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day melt gently from your shoulders. The world is quiet now, and time itself seems to soften. Drift with me into the distant past, where moonlight rests on marble columns, and the night air carries the scent of ancient fig trees. The hills of Macedonia sleep beneath a blanket of silver mist, and somewhere, in the hush of a candle-lit palace, a child stirs. He is not yet a conqueror, not yet a legend. He is simply a boy, born into a world that would one day bow before his name. This is the story of Alexander the Great, told not with battle cries or blazing horns, but with calm wonder. A gentle unfolding across mountains, deserts, and oceans, where every footstep carries the echo of ambition, and it begins, as all great stories do, in silence. This is Drift Off to History, where we bring calm stories for curious minds. Chapter 1. A Dream is Born, long before his name whispered through the corridors of history, before the cities, the empires, the statues in distant lands. Alexander was simply a boy beneath the stars. It was a warm summer night in 356 BCE in the ancient city of Pella. The crickets hummed softly outside the palace walls, and torchlight flickered against stone columns as Queen Olympias cradled her newborn son. That night, strange signs were said to have appeared across the skies: silent storms, distant fires, and the temple of Artemis, far away in Ephesus, mysteriously engulfed in flames. The seers murmured that the child born beneath such omens would not live an ordinary life. His father was Philip II, King of Macedonia, a man both feared and admired, a brilliant tactician who had united Greece through iron, wit, and will. His mother, Olympias, fiery and devout, believed her son to be descended from gods. She whispered to him ancient tales of heroes and destiny, of bloodlines traced to Achilles himself. Even as an infant, she believed, Alexander carried the light of greatness. As a child, he was curious, quiet but sharp. He listened more than he spoke, often seated beneath fig trees with a book of Homer in his lap, his young fingers tracing the lines of the Iliad like scripture. Achilles was more than a character to him. He was an ideal, a flame to follow. And so the boy, who would become a legend, began by studying them, those who came before, those who dared to chase immortality. When he turned 13, his father summoned a tutor who would shape his soul as surely as the sword shaped his arm. Aristotle, the philosopher, came to the royal court, bringing scrolls and questions, not commands. Under his guidance, Alexander learned about the stars above and the anatomy of the human body. He studied ethics and politics, poetry and medicine. The world expanded with every lesson, and so did his hunger to see it all for himself. There is a story, often told and seldom doubted, of the day Alexander tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus. The beast had thrown every rider and terrified the court. But Alexander, barely more than a boy, saw what others had missed. The horse was not wild, merely frightened of its own shadow. He turned Bucephalus toward the sun, so that the shadow fell behind them, and then climbed onto his back. From that moment on, the two were inseparable, riding together from boyhood to the ends of the world. As Alexander grew, so too did the world around him. The palace was filled with maps, strategy, whispers of wars to come. He watched his father unite Greece, not with poetry, but with power. And yet, even then, Alexander's eyes drifted eastward, past the Aegean toward Persia, Egypt, and beyond, the places of myth, the lands of gods. At night, lying beneath painted constellations on his chamber ceiling, he would stare into the dark and imagine the world as one unbroken road, not divided by language or walls, but stretched endlessly before him. He didn't crave peace nor plunder. He craved meaning, a place in time so deeply etched that not even the stars would forget him. And so, under a sky littered with dreams, with the scent of olive groves drifting in through open windows, a fire quietly took hold. A dream began to grow, not loud or sudden, but slow and certain. A dream of something more, of everything. Chapter 2, The Young King. The wheels of fate often turn when the world is least prepared. It was the summer of 336 BCE, and the palace in Aegae was alive with celebration. King Philip II was hosting a grand wedding, an alliance forged, a future secured. Musicians played softly in the courtyards, wine flowed like water, and the torches lining the marble halls burned bright into the night. But beneath the canopy of festivity, a shadow crept in. Philip, the mighty king who had bound Greece under his rule, was assassinated as he walked through the theatre, struck down by one of his own guards. In an instant, everything changed. Alexander was just 20 years old, young by any measure, but no stranger to power. When the news reached him, there was no outward panic, no faltering step. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around him, like armor. Then, with a quiet breath, he stepped forward and claimed the throne of Macedonia. The court watched with wide eyes, some in fear, some in doubt. But Alexander did not waver. He had been waiting for this moment all his life. Yet a crown is never simply inherited, it must be held. News of Philip's death rippled across the Greek world like the tremor before a storm. Cities that had once bowed to Macedon began to stir. In Thebes, in Athens, in Thessaly, voices rose in rebellion. Whispers filled the air. The boy is too young. The kingdom will fall. But Alexander, calm as dawn, gathered his men and moved swiftly. Southward he rode, across river and ridge, his army tight and disciplined. Where there was hesitation, he soothed. Where there was defiance, he struck. In Thessaly, he found his path blocked, trapped between a cliff and an enemy force. Yet instead of retreating, Alexander led his cavalry through a secret mountain pass, appearing suddenly behind the enemy lines. His audacity stunned them into surrender. In Thebes, where resistance hardened, he laid siege with force and finality. The city fell, and though the punishment was harsh, it was not without reason. He spared the innocent, protected the temples, and sent a message across all of Greece. The king may be young, but he is not weak. By the time he reached Athens, no sword was drawn. The great thinkers and orators of the city, those who had once questioned Philip's rise, now watched Alexander with wary respect. He spoke with confidence, not cruelty, reminding them of unity, of shared purpose, of the Persian threat looming to the east. And they listened. With Greece pacified, the League of Corinth reaffirmed Alexander as its leader, its hegemon. It was a title his father had claimed with iron. Alexander, however, wore it like silk, effortlessly, as though it had always belonged to him. But even as he stood at the summit of Greek power, his eyes looked farther still. Persia, that ancient land of gold and grandeur, the empire of Darius III. His father had dreamed of taking it, but had died before his army could set sail. Now that dream belonged to Alexander. At night he would sit alone in his tent, scrolls and maps unfurled before him, the candlelight flickering over seas and mountain ranges inked by ancient hands. He traced the path to Babylon with gentle fingers. He whispered the names of cities he had never seen. His gaze was not fixed on the borders of his own kingdom, but on the horizon, always the horizon. And so, in the quiet before the great march began, Alexander did not celebrate. He prepared. He strengthened his army, ensured his allies, and secured his homeland with care. He was not a boy pretending to be a king. He was a king with the soul of a visionary and the heart of a storm. The world beyond Greece still slumbered beneath the weight of its own certainty. Persia remained vast and proud, but Alexander was ready. His journey had not yet truly begun, but already the winds had shifted. Somewhere in the distance, fate was waiting. Chapter 3: Conquering Greece. Morning rose slowly over the mountains of Macedonia, casting long shadows across stone roads and sunlit fields. The cicadas began their gentle chorus as the breeze stirred the olive groves, and in the stillness of early light, the world seemed to hold its breath. Alexander, newly crowned, stood at the threshold of something vast. His grip on the throne was secure, for now, but the land beneath his feet remained restless. Though his swift action had quelled rebellion, true unity still lingered out of reach. The Greek city-states, proud, ancient, independent, had not forgotten their own power. And while many had accepted Macedon's rule under Philip, the bonds of loyalty were fragile, stretched thin by old rivalries and older pride. But Alexander did not fear resistance. He understood the heart of Greece. He knew it was not a land ruled only by strength, but by memory, by myths, by honor, by the whispered names of heroes. So he did not march on Greece with arrogance. He journeyed as one who had listened to Homer at twilight and spoken the language of the gods. His first steps took him south through Thessaly, where leaders once again tested his resolve. But Alexander, calm as the sea before dawn, moved swiftly and with grace. He avoided bloodshed when he could, but never hesitated when firm action was needed. At Thermopylae, the sacred pass where Spartans had once made their final stand, he paused, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. There, he honored the fallen, paying tribute to the warriors of old. The Greeks watched and began to understand. This was not a tyrant. This was a student of their stories, and perhaps a new legend of their own. In Corinth, the heart of alliance and philosophy, Alexander was confirmed as supreme commander of the Hellenic League, the same title his father had once held. It was here that the air grew softer, the olive trees cast longer shadows, and old men spoke again of hope. Even the philosopher Diogenes, known for his biting tongue and austere life in a barrel, looked up at Alexander and, with a faint smile, asked only that the young king step aside and stop blocking his sunlight. Alexander laughed, not with scorn, but with admiration. "If I were not Alexander," he said, "I would wish to be Diogenes." He understood something essential, that greatness was not measured only in victories, but in wisdom and in how one stood among others. In Athens, the city of thinkers and dreamers, he did not demand submission. He offered reassurance. He respected their customs, their voice, their history. The Athenians, wary but moved, offered their allegiance, not out of fear, but out of cautious belief. By spring, the lands of Greece had grown quiet again, not silent with oppression, but settled, as though the earth itself sensed a coming change. The cities stood behind Alexander now, united in name, if not yet in spirit, and the long-held dream of crossing into Asia, the dream his father had carried like a torch in the dark, was ready to be fulfilled. The harbours filled with ships, provisions were gathered, soldiers trained beneath the soft bloom of almond trees, their movements steady, their eyes turned east. Alexander did not rush. He prepared as the seasons turned, letting each step of readiness fall into place like stones in a sacred path. And one quiet morning, with a sky clear and blue as polished glass, he stood on the edge of the sea. The Hellespont shimmered before him, the thin silver ribbon that separated Europe from Asia. He gazed across the water, not with impatience, but with a long, thoughtful calm. For beyond that narrow strait lay Persia, the beginning of everything, the edge of every map he had ever traced as a child. And so, Greece lay behind him, steady and still, and the world ahead, vast and waiting, began to stir. Chapter 4. The Persian Campaign begins. The sea was calm the morning Alexander crossed it, the surface of the Hellespont shimmering like a sheet of silver silk beneath the rising sun. His ships, quiet and low in the water, cut gentle paths through the waves as gulls circled high above, their cries carried softly on the wind. This was no ordinary voyage. It was a passage between worlds. Behind him lay Greece, unified and hushed. Before him stretched Asia, vast and ancient, where the old empire of Persia waited with all its gold and glory. As his boots touched the far shore, Alexander paused. According to tradition, he stepped down from his ship in full armor, picked up a handful of earth, and declared the land his by right of conquest. But there was no thunder in his voice, only quiet certainty. His men followed in silence, their eyes drawn eastward toward a future none could yet see. The campaign had begun, not with the clash of swords, but with the steady rhythm of footsteps across unfamiliar ground. Alexander's army, 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, marched in perfect formation, their spirits high and their king beside them, not behind. He rode Bucephalus at the front, speaking to his men by name, sharing their meals, sleeping beneath the same stars. He was not above them, he was with them. The first great challenge came at the river Granicus, where Persian satraps had gathered a formidable force to block the Macedonian advance. The river's current was swift, its banks steep, and lined with armoured cavalry. Alexander's generals urged caution. A direct assault, they warned, would be costly. But Alexander, calm and resolute, saw not danger, but opportunity. In the golden light of late afternoon, he led the charge. His cavalry plunged into the river, water splashing high around them as arrows darkened the sky. Alexander was among the first to reach the opposite bank, his sword drawn, his gaze fixed. The Persians, caught off guard by the sheer boldness of the attack, faltered. The lines broke. Victory came swiftly. It was not just a battle, it was a message. Persia was not invincible. The young king from the west had arrived, and he would not be turned back. City after city followed. Sardis, once a proud Persian stronghold, surrendered without resistance. Ephesus, whose temples had long echoed with foreign tongues, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. In each place, he moved with grace and discipline, respecting temples, restoring laws, offering honor where honor was due. He did not come to burn, but to build, and so the people began to trust him. But even as victories mounted, Alexander never lost sight of what lay ahead. Darius, the king of kings, still ruled from deep within Persia's heartland. His armies were larger, his wealth beyond measure. The path to him would be long and uncertain. Yet Alexander pressed on, not with haste, but with purpose. As the army made camp under an open sky, the fires burned low, and the men settled into sleep. The air was warm and still. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly, and in his tent, lit only by the flicker of a lamp, Alexander unrolled his maps. His finger traced the lines of distant rivers and unknown roads, pausing at names spoken only in legend. The world stretched out before him like a dream. And now, with each quiet victory, he stepped further into it, guided not by conquest alone, but by a vision far greater than empire. The stars above watched in silence. The earth turned slowly beneath him, and the boy, who had once gazed at painted constellations from a palace in Pella, was now walking among the lands they had only imagined. Chapter 5. The Gordian Knot. The spring air in central Anatolia was thick with the scent of wild thyme and sun-warmed earth. As Alexander's army moved inland, away from the coasts and cities newly brought under his command, the land seemed to stretch open before them. Rolling hills dotted with fig trees, ancient roads winding through sleepy villages. The rhythm of marching feet softened to the pace of calm travel. For now, there was no battle, only the journey. At the heart of this quiet landscape lay the city of Gordium, nestled in the fertile plains of Phrygia. It was a place wrapped in legend, older than memory, once the capital of a long-faded kingdom. But it was not its temples or towers that drew Alexander's gaze. It was an old wagon, half forgotten in the palace square, a wooden chariot, its yoke bound by a knot, so tangled and intricate that no one could say where it began or ended. The story went that long ago an oracle had prophesied. Whoever could unravel the knot would rule all of Asia. Many had tried. All had failed. Alexander approached the wagon in silence, his men watching from a respectful distance. The knot, thick with age, was hard and weathered, like the roots of an ancient tree twisted by centuries. He circled it slowly, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes thoughtful but calm. The square was hushed, the breeze gentle, as if the world itself were leaning in to see what he would do. Some say he studied the knot for a long time, searching for the hidden end. Others say he paused only briefly, then drew his sword and cut through it with a single stroke. Either way, the result was the same. The knot fell, the rope parted, and the prophecy, in its quiet, mysterious way, was fulfilled. But it wasn't the act alone that mattered, it was what it revealed. Alexander did not believe in waiting for permission. Where others saw complexity, he sought clarity. Where tradition demanded patience, he offered resolve. He didn't solve the problem within the rules. He stepped beyond them, and in doing so, he made the impossible simple. The priests of Gordium, stunned at first, declared the act valid, perhaps even divinely inspired. His men, already loyal, now looked at him with something deeper than admiration. A quiet awe, for here was a king who could reshape not only the world, but the very meaning of fate. That night, the army camped beneath a sky littered with stars. The fires burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the fields. And as the men drifted into sleep, stories of the knot passed from tent to tent, spoken in low voices, like a lullaby of destiny. Alexander said little. He sat by the fire, the glow reflecting off his armor, Bucephalus, dozing nearby. Perhaps he thought of the path ahead, of Darius, still distant but growing ever closer. Or perhaps he thought of the boy he once was, reading Homer beneath the trees, wondering how a name might outlive a lifetime. Either way, the knot was gone. The road stretched forward, and history, quiet for a moment, waited to stir once more. Chapter 6. The Battle of Issus. The road to Issus wound along narrow valleys and rocky coastlines, where the mountains of Cilicia rose like sleeping giants, and the sea whispered just beyond reach. Alexander's army moved with quiet determination, their footsteps softened by dust, their hearts steadied by trust. Though they had left familiar lands far behind, they felt the pull of something greater, of a path no longer guided merely by maps, but by momentum, by vision. by fate. As they reached the plains near the river Pinarus, the wind changed. Scouts returned with news that quickened the silence of the camp. King Darius himself was near, the great king of Persia, the ruler of the East. He had crossed the mountains behind them, bringing with him an army so vast it seemed to darken the horizon. Tens of thousands of men, archers, chariots, cavalry, arrayed in colours the Macedonians had never seen before, gold and silk, banners rippling like fire in the wind. And so, in a narrow valley by the sea, the two great forces of the age were about to meet. That night, Alexander's camp lay quiet beneath a blanket of stars. There were no cries of fear, no songs of bravado, just the soft murmurs of men preparing for dawn. Some polished armour, others sat in stillness, sharpening blades by candlelight, and in the centre of it all, their king moved among them, calm, grounded. His presence, steady as stone, settled their nerves more than any speech ever could. He had never fought a battle like this before, not against such overwhelming numbers, but he knew that the land could be his ally. The narrow plain, hemmed in by sea and mountain, meant that Darius's great numbers would count for less. The Persians would be forced to fight head-on, where skill and strategy could tip the scales. At first light, a pale mist hung low across the valley. The ground beneath their feet was cool with dew. Alexander took his place at the head of the cavalry, Bucephalus shifting gently beneath him. His men looked to him, and he looked ahead, not at the numbers, not at the splendour, but at the shape of the land, the bend of the river, the rhythm of the moment. Then the order came. The Macedonian phalanx advanced with precision, shields raised, spears gleaming like a field of silver reeds. Alexander led the right flank, his cavalry sweeping wide toward the Persian centre. The clash, when it came, was like thunder wrapped in silk, chaotic, beautiful, terrible. But through it all, Alexander never wavered. He moved like water, cutting a path through confusion, his voice clear, his movements measured. In the heart of the battle he caught sight of Darius's royal chariot, gilded and flanked by guards. And then something unexpected happened. The great king turned and fled. Panic rippled through the Persian ranks. Without their leader the lines crumbled. What had begun as an overwhelming show of Persian power ended in swift retreat. The battle was over. The Macedonians had won. Among the spoils of the Persian camp, Alexander found something remarkable. Darius's own mother, wife, and children, left behind in the chaos. But instead of treating them as trophies, he treated them with honor. He assured the Queen Mother that her son still lived. He offered them protection, dignity, and peace. It was not just a military victory. It was a display of character, of grace amid triumph. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, the valley of Issus fell silent. The battlefield, once alive with the sounds of war, was now lit only by the glow of cooking fires and the quiet breathing of resting soldiers. Alexander sat alone, gazing out toward the horizon, where the shadow of Persia still loomed, distant but wounded. He had faced the great king and prevailed, yet there was no celebration, no boastful roar, only the quiet knowledge that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long. Babylon still waited, Persepolis, the heart of the empire. And so, as sleep settled over the camp like a blanket of mist, Alexander closed his eyes, not as a boy seeking greatness, but as a man walking ever deeper into it. Chapter 7. Egypt and the founding of Alexandria. The road turned south now, winding gently through the lands of the Levant, where ancient cities clung to the edge of the sea like pearls sewn into the coast. After the great victory at Issus, Alexander did not rush onward toward the heart of Persia. Instead, he moved slowly, purposefully, clearing each path behind him like a painter sweeping his brush across a vast canvas. He secured the ports one by one, for he knew that no empire could stand without the sea at its back. The most difficult of these cities was Tyre, a proud island fortress surrounded by waves and walled in stone. It resisted fiercely for months, but Alexander, with the patience of tides, built a causeway from the shore to the island itself. Stone by stone, sand by sand, he brought the land to the sea. It was not just a feat of engineering, it was a testament to will, and when Tyre fell, the way to Egypt opened at last. Egypt, land of sun and silence, of drifting sands and gods older than memory. When Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he did not come as a conqueror, but as something else entirely. The people, long weary of Persian rule, welcomed him with open arms and quiet reverence. There were no battles here, no sieges, only offerings, only peace. He traveled to Memphis, the ancient city on the Nile, where priests greeted him in white linen and incense filled the warm air. He offered sacrifices to their gods, not out of performance, but of respect. He understood something vital, that empire was not built by force alone, but by listening, learning, and honoring what came before. In the golden hush of a desert morning, he made a journey into the sands, beyond the reach of cities, into the shimmering heat of the western desert. He rode to the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, a sacred place hidden among dunes and palm groves, where legend said the voice of the gods could be heard. The journey was long, the sun relentless, the path marked only by stars and instinct. Yet he pressed on, quiet and steady, guided by dreams and a whisper in his soul. When he arrived, the priest led him into the temple. What was said inside, no one truly knows. Some claimed the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Others said he asked about the limits of his empire, or the fate that awaited him. But when he emerged, his expression was calm, his step unhurried. He had heard something that would stay with him all his life. It was in Egypt, on a wind-blown stretch of coast, where the Nile met the sea, that Alexander made one of his most lasting decisions. Standing beneath a pale sky, where gulls circled above and waves whispered against the shore, he marked out the foundations of a new city. He sketched it with flour, tracing the roads and walls with a soldier's eye and a philosopher's heart. He named it Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities the world would ever know, a center of knowledge, art, trade, and culture, a meeting place of East and West. But on that day, it was only an idea, a dream pressed gently into the sand. As his army rested in the warmth of Egypt, Alexander prepared to move again. Persia still waited. Darius still lived. The greatest battles were yet to come. But for a moment, the world was still. The sun rose slowly over the river, casting golden light across the palms and temples. And the young king, born beneath the stars of Macedonia, now stood at the edge of Africa, with the Nile at his feet, and a city behind his name. The desert winds carried his thoughts eastward, toward what was still to be, toward glory, yes, but also toward mystery, toward longing, toward something that even he could not yet name. Chapter 8, The Battle of Gaugamela. The journey to Gaugamela stretched across vast and shifting lands, fields of golden grain, endless plains where the wind moved like water, and distant hills that shimmered in the heat. By now, Alexander and his army had crossed rivers and deserts, mountains and marshes. They had seen the wide breadth of Asia, and they had not broken. They had only grown stronger. Far to the east, King Darius had gathered his strength once more. This time, he did not rely on speed or surprise. He prepared for war with all the wealth and power of the Persian Empire behind him. The plain of Gaugamela, carefully chosen and flattened for chariots, would be his stage. His army was said to be enormous, perhaps 5 times the size of Alexander's. Elephants stood in the ranks, scythed chariots gleamed beneath the sun. And in the heart of it all, Darius waited. But Alexander was not afraid. He arrived with his men beneath a pale blue sky, the autumn air dry and cool. The land before them stretched wide and flat, dusted with sand and ready for the weight of war. But that night, the Macedonian camp was still. There were no frantic preparations, no raised voices, just the sound of sharpening steel, the soft murmurs of prayer, and the rustling of canvas in the breeze. Alexander slept soundly beneath the stars, wrapped in his cloak, Bucephalus nearby. His generals, anxious and restless, asked how he could sleep with such a storm on the horizon. He smiled and replied, "Because the danger has not yet arrived." When dawn broke, it came slowly, with the soft light of sunrise spilling across the plain. The Persian army stretched into the distance, a living tide of colour and movement. But Alexander, calm and composed, had studied the ground. He had mapped every curve and hollow. He did not see chaos, he saw patterns. He saw opportunities. He arranged his men with care, phalanxes in the centre, cavalry on the flanks, reserves hidden and ready, and then, with a quiet command, they moved forward. What followed was not a storm, but a symphony. Persian chariots charged, their blades spinning, slicing through the air. Alexander's men parted, letting them pass harmlessly through, then closed ranks behind them like water settling after a stone. The Persian cavalry swept wide, hoping to encircle, but Alexander saw it coming. He shifted his lines, his army flowing like a single breathing creature. And then, with the precision of a falcon diving from the sky, Alexander found his moment. He led a charge directly toward the Persian center, toward Darius himself. Dust rose in plumes, spears clashed. The world narrowed to a heartbeat. Darius looked out from his chariot and saw the tide turning. He saw Macedonian spears growing nearer, and once again he fled. The Persian lines collapsed. The great army of the east began to break, to scatter, to vanish into the desert winds. The battle was over. Gaugamela was won. It was not just another victory. It was the final breath of an empire. With that one battle, Alexander had shattered the power of Persia. Babylon, Susa, and eventually Persepolis would fall before him. The road lay open now, all the way to the ends of the earth, but there was no celebration that night, only silence. The men, exhausted and dusty, rested beneath a sky lit with stars. Fires burned low. The sounds of the battlefield faded into memory. Alexander walked alone among the fallen, the cool wind brushing his cheeks, his thoughts as distant as the moon. He had dreamed of this moment, he had reached it, but the weight of it was heavier than he had imagined. Victory was not an end, it was a door, opening into the unknown. Chapter 9. The March East. The Empire of Persia had fallen, but Alexander did not stop. Most would have returned home by now, their names already etched into history, their stories complete. But Alexander's vision was not made of boundaries or thrones. He did not march east for wealth or conquest alone. He marched for something deeper, something unnamed, unmeasured, unreachable. The horizon had always whispered to him, and now he followed its call into lands unknown, beyond Babylon and Susa, beyond the riches of Persepolis. The terrain began to change. The air grew thinner, the winds colder. Alexander's army moved into the highlands of Bactria, where snow lingered on the mountain tops, and silence lived between the stones. The cities here did not fall easily. They resisted, they hid, they fled to the hills. These were not the soft lands of the West, but hard and wild places, shaped by centuries of survival. But Alexander did not falter. He moved through mountain passes and across frozen rivers, his cloak drawn tight, his eyes set forward. He fought not only enemies now, but distance, exhaustion, the slow weight of time. And yet his men followed, not just because they feared him or loved him, but because he still believed in something beyond the next ridge, something more than glory. In Bactria, he met Roxana, a noble woman of striking presence, known for her courage and grace. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, and in a quiet ceremony far from the courts of Greece or the grandeur of Persia, Alexander married her. It was not only a union of hearts, but of cultures, a signal to the world that his empire would not be divided by heritage or birth, that East and West, long strangers, could become one. As the months turned into years, Alexander founded new cities, brought water to dry lands, and placed Greek governors in eastern territories. But he also adopted Eastern customs. He wore Persian robes, sat on Persian thrones. To many of his followers, it was strange, unfamiliar. Some whispered that he was no longer the Macedonian boy who had once gazed at Homer's verses beneath a quiet tree. But Alexander saw himself as something new, not Greek, not Persian, but a bridge between worlds. In these distant lands, the pace of time seemed to slow. The air was thinner, the stars sharper, the nights colder and longer. Fires burned low in mountain camps, and dreams drifted in and out of sleep like ghosts. The men grew tired, their faces older, their thoughts often turning to home, but still they followed. Alexander, ever restless, pressed further, toward the unknown, toward India. He had set out not to rule the world as it was, but to remake it. And though the journey had grown long, and the light sometimes dimmed, he still walked beneath the stars, as if they were guiding him somewhere just beyond sight. Chapter 10. India and the Edge of the World. India had always lived at the edge of Alexander's maps, drawn in soft curves and uncertain lines, a place of mystery and light where the sun was said to rise from golden waters. It was not only distant, it was sacred. To reach it was to reach the ends of the earth, to brush the edge of the world's breath. The path into India was not easy. The land was lush and humid, the rivers deep and swift. Monsoons swept across the plains like whispered storms, and the forests echoed with birdsong and the hum of unseen life. It was unlike anything Alexander's men had known, strange and beautiful, overwhelming and endless. They moved forward through emerald fields and tangled groves, sometimes welcomed with offerings, sometimes met with resistance. And then came the Hydaspes River. On its banks stood King Porus, tall and proud, his army flanked by chariots and enormous war elephants. To the Greeks, the creatures were awe-inspiring, their size and power unlike anything in the West. The river, swollen with rain, seemed impossible to cross, but Alexander, always searching for the path others did not see, waited for the right moment. On a stormy night, beneath clouds stitched with lightning, he led a secret crossing upstream. His men silent in the rain, the sound of hooves muffled by wet earth. At dawn, they struck. The Battle of the Hydaspes was fierce, fought in mud and thunder, under skies that never cleared. The elephants roared, the Rhine fell, but Alexander, guiding his men like a conductor of soundless music, turned the tide. Porus, though defeated, stood with dignity. When brought before Alexander, the king was asked how he wished to be treated. He replied simply, "Like a king." And Alexander, moved by his strength and honor, did just that. He returned his lands, his title, and gained a friend where he might have made another enemy. But victory did not bring celebration. For the first time, Alexander's men began to hesitate. They had marched for years, fought countless battles, crossed deserts, climbed mountains, weathered every hardship the world could offer. And now, before them, stretched yet another endless land, India's vast interior, the unknown beyond the unknown. They gathered beneath a great tree, weary and silent, and begged him to turn back. Alexander walked among them slowly. He did not shout. He did not demand. He listened. And then, standing before them, his voice calm and low, he spoke not as a king, but as one who had walked every step beside them. He reminded them of what they had done, what they had seen, what they had become. And finally, he gave them what they most longed for, rest. They would not go further. The journey had reached its furthest point, and so the army turned back, following the Indus River southward toward the sea. The return was long and bitter. The heat was merciless. Alexander himself was wounded by an arrow, nearly killed, but he survived. His body weakened, but his spirit did not fade. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the river, he stood alone on the shore. The sky burned gold and violet. The water lapped gently at his boots. He had come farther than anyone before him. He had stood at the edge of the known world, and now, with silence all around, he let the moment pass through him like wind through leaves. He did not cry out to the heavens. He did not mark it with ceremony. He simply looked east, and then turned home. Chapter 11. The Return and the Toll. The journey home was not a triumphant march, but a slow, quiet unravelling. Alexander had seen the edge of the world, touched lands few had ever dreamed of, and now turned his face westward. But the path back to Babylon was long, and the years of conquest had left their mark. His army moved more slowly now. The men, once eager and bright-eyed, had grown tired, older, thinner, worn by time and travel. The fire had not gone out, but it flickered gently, more ash than flame. They passed through the deserts of Gedrosia, where the sun scorched the earth and no trees offered shade. The sands stretched endlessly. Men collapsed from heat and thirst. Horses perished. Supplies failed. It was a march of endurance, not glory, and through it all, Alexander pressed on, not because he did not feel the pain, but because he believed that survival too was a form of victory. When they reached friendlier lands once more, there was no grand celebration, only the soft relief of shade, water, and rest. But the toll had been more than physical. In the months that followed, Alexander suffered a loss deeper than any he had faced on the battlefield. Hephaestion, his closest companion, his childhood friend, his second self, fell ill and died. The news broke through the camp like a silent wave, and when Alexander heard it, he did not shout, or curse, or command. He simply stopped. For days he refused food. He tore his robes. He lay beside the body and wept. All the cities, all the crowns, all the maps he had redrawn, none of it could soothe the emptiness. It was as if the world, for a moment, had become colourless. He held the funeral in Babylon. It was not merely grand, it was sacred. Statues were raised. Flames burned through the night. Hephaestion's name was written into stone, into memory. And through the morning, something in Alexander began to dim. Still, he worked. He made plans for the future. More cities to build, new trade routes, a unified army of Greeks and Persians marching side by side. He saw not the end of empire, but the beginning of something more enduring. Yet even as he mapped out this vision, his body began to falter. Fever touched him. His strength waned. The long years of battle, of endless movement, of loss and longing, they had caught up with him. And yet he said nothing of defeat. He moved through his days like a man still chasing the horizon. He listened to philosophers. He received envoys. He spoke of exploring Arabia, of sailing into the southern seas. But the stars above him had begun to flicker more faintly, and deep inside, perhaps he knew, the journey was drawing to a close. Chapter 12. A sudden end. It happened in Babylon, beneath skies wide and pale, where the sun drifted slowly over the city's ziggurats and gardens. The Euphrates moved like a dark ribbon through the plains, and the air, though heavy with heat, carried the scent of spring. Alexander had returned from the edges of the world not to rest, but to build. Babylon was to be the heart of his new empire, where east met west, where cultures blended like colours on a fading tapestry. The plans were endless: roads to be carved, harbours to be deepened, ambassadors to be welcomed. He dreamed of exploration, of learning, of uniting the peoples of his vast domain under a single vision, not through fear, but through shared purpose. Even as his body tired, his mind burned brightly, and then, quite suddenly, he fell ill. At first it was only a fever, a weight in his limbs, a dryness in his throat. He continued his duties, though his voice grew softer, his footsteps slower. Then came the shivering, the weakness. His strength, once enough to cross empires, seemed to slip through his fingers like water. His generals gathered around him, whispering, waiting. Each day, his condition worsened. For 11 days, he lay in a quiet room in the royal palace, the air thick with silence. He was 32 years old. Some say he was poisoned. Others say the years had simply caught up with him, that the deserts, the wounds, the sorrow had worn him thin. But there were no clear answers, only the slow, steady fading of a man who had never paused, now lying still for the first time. As he drifted in and out of sleep, his men filed past his bed. According to one story, he could no longer speak, but raised his hand in silent farewell as they passed. When asked who should inherit his empire, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest," and then he was gone. No great storm marked the moment, no trumpet or thunderclap, only stillness. Outside, the palms swayed gently in the wind, the river moved on, and in the heart of a vast and scattered empire, a silence spread, soft, uncertain, profound. Alexander of Macedon had lived a life that bent the world around it, and now, in the hush after his passing, that world stood still, if only for a moment. Chapter 13. A legacy like no other. When the last breath left Alexander's body, the world did not shatter, it softened. There was no single successor, no heir to carry the weight of his vision. His generals, once united by loyalty, now drifted like fragments of a shattered star, each claiming a part of what he had left behind. The great empire he had built in just over a decade began to divide, to fracture, to fade into the hands of others. But something deeper remained. In the cities he founded, life continued. Alexandria in Egypt grew into a beacon of knowledge, home to the world's largest library, where scholars studied beneath oil lamps and papyrus whispered in the breeze. In Asia, roads he had carved still led travelers between worlds. In the East, Greek blended with Persian, and cultures once thought irreconcilable began to learn from one another. Alexander did not live to see these things. He did not rule a lasting empire, but what he left behind was not simply land or titles. It was an idea that the world was larger than any border, that it could be crossed, shared, understood. In the centuries that followed, his name was carried on by poets and kings, carved into stone and memory. Some called him a god, others, a dreamer with a sword. But even today, more than 2,000 years later, his story lingers, in books, in ruins, in the night sky, where constellations shift over lands he once touched. He had not lived a long life, but he had lived a full one, a life that rose like a comet, brilliant and brief, searing across the horizon. And so, Alexander passed into legend, where history softens into myth, and time folds gently around the stories we choose to keep. Chapter 14. Drift off through the ages. Now the story is done, and the world begins to grow still. The dust of ancient roads has settled, the clash of swords has quieted, and the boy who once looked up at painted constellations in a Macedonian palace has become, at last, a part of the stars. Let your mind wander now, far from the noise of the day. Drift softly through the world Alexander once knew, the golden hills of Greece, the riverbanks of Babylon, the quiet sands of Egypt at sunrise. Picture the great cities glowing with torchlight, their markets silent, their stone steps cool beneath the moon. Picture a single tent in the desert, where a young king traces the edge of a map, his eyes filled not with what is, but what might be. He never reached the ends of the earth, none of us truly do, but he followed the horizon with all his heart, and in doing so, left behind more than empires. He left a story, and now, as you rest in the hush of your own evening, that story wraps gently around you, like a soft cloak, like a lullaby sung by time. You are not in your room anymore. You are drifting with him, through marble halls and starlit deserts, beside a fire where history flickers low and slow. The world is quiet now, and so are you. Sleep well, traveller of time. The journey will continue, but for now, the stars are waiting.